Hello folks, welcome to the latest video in the 172nd Air Wing channel. Let me just start off by saying that you might hear some background noise as I'm recording this from home, so I do apologize in advance if you hear some wind noise or some background going on. But today's video is going to be partly a reaction, partly a fix, and partly an explanation video. In the explanation I want to talk about are some of the business realities of making a model, which hopefully will give some context behind why Calibre Wings releases like this Splinter Tomcat have had the occasional hiccup or issue. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, we'll just get to the solution right away. This particular F-14 has got a problem with the horizontal stabilizer. This little guy over here has had issues with scraping the paint due to a malfunction with how the paint was applied at the factory. How that happened is one of the things I'm going to touch on in this video, but let me just show you the fix that I did for this guy. So what I did here is I took, you might be able to see it right here, I took a couple of pieces of just your general normal clear Scotch tape that you might find in any office, and I applied it to this part of the fuselage. So basically the area between the horizontal stabilizer here and the fuselage there. Okay, be able to see that a little bit clearer. This, by the way, was an area where it was scratched when I took this out of the box. So I was kind of thinking about how I would go about solving the problem of painting this over, or also addressing the issue of the stabilizer, which is extraordinarily loose if I don't, it's very loose if I don't put something here to kind of add friction. So I just put a couple of pieces of thin Scotch tape over this guy, really small pieces, maybe not even 1/4 of an inch, probably like half your thumbnail. Put those pieces there, and that definitely seems to have solved the problem. Apologies if you have a hard time seeing this, but I'm being gentle because I don't want to scratch it with my tweezers. But effectively, by doing this, it's positioned it in a setup where I can display the stabilizer pretty much in any position I want, and it will stay in place. It also nicely covers up the scratch that was there when I opened it, and you can kind of see right there, I didn't put a piece over that section, but that's what this whole portion of the aircraft looks like without the tape in place. So it's a nice little solution. It covers up the markings, and it also means I can display the model without really showing the scratches there. So yeah, definitely a minor thing to do. That's just something that I did to fix it. So for those of you who might consider ordering this guy from Calibre as like a quasi scratch and dent special, I guess, just be aware that you can probably address that with a couple of pieces of really affordable tape. And for me, I did that because shipping this guy back to the dealer and then having them send it back to Hong Kong and then having to repeat the trip coming back to the US, that's just more logistical trouble that I'm really prepared to deal with. And the rest of the model looks really good. So for like 2 cents worth of tape to fix that, it's not a big deal for me. So anyways, now we can kind of talk about how that sort of defect happened. And that's getting into kind of the business behind how these models are created. You see, Noel's not sitting at a table with a kit, toiling away by himself, individually painting every part and component on this airplane, right? Because if he had an 800 run production model, he'd be spending his entire life basically toiling away making these models by hand. So he's not doing that, right? What he's doing is he has to, there are several steps he has to do to get a model created, right? And do correct me in the comment section if you have some insight into maybe how this process works in greater detail. So effectively, the first thing he has to do is he has to do research, right? He has to figure out what the thing looks like in real life. And this can get very tricky, especially with certain models that were made in, like, you know, the Soviet Union, for example, or in some country where color photographs are just really difficult to get. So then, of course, if there's no pictures that he can access, he has nothing to work with in terms of making a 3D model to even produce it with. So the first challenge to overcome is just getting the data that you need to even make the thing accurately. So in something like this, which is like an NSAWC Tomcat, getting the information is pretty relatively easy, but he still has to go out and do the research, right? So that's the first step, and this is the part where people say, well, the paint doesn't match this model, or the color scheme is incorrect or something. And that's generally because maybe some point in the research phase something got crossed, and the older and more obscure the airplane is, the harder and harder this is to do, which it's kind of interesting because with certain aircraft like the SR-71s, the A-12s, or the U-2s, many of them were classified when they were in operational service, which means finding accurate pictures of airplanes that were in a classified status, very difficult to do for obvious reasons. So because of this, the research phase is something that Noel has to do and his team has to do, and they have to get it pretty much 100% right, or the model is basically broken from that point forward. So the research phase has to be done. That takes time. Then they have to create a 3D model, which is apparently an instance where Noel has had some problems, because with aircraft like the B-58 or the U-2, which aren't necessarily common designs, you know, somebody has to sit down at a computer and turn those photos that the research phase has compiled into a 3D model that can be converted into some kind of tooling. And if that stage is messed up or isn't completed, then that pretty much kills the project right there too. So there's a couple of projects right now as of today's live stream in April 2021 where Noel has the data, but he can't get the information into a 3D drawing because no one's taken on the job of doing it yet. So no 3D drawing means no tooling means no model. So that's the next phase that has to happen. After the tooling is, the 3D model is done, then the tooling has to be created, and the tooling has to be accurate, because if that's messed up, then potentially the entire lineup is messed up as well. So when it comes to tooling, some sort of process has to be created which creates, you know, the wings or the pylons, the landing gear assembly, because this part right here, right, the landing gear assembly, this isn't just one cast piece, right? There's the piece for the wheel, there's a piece for the strut, there's a piece for the connecting strut, and then there's a piece for the doors, and it all has to come together, right? So even though this may be one part, when you open up the box, there could be anywhere from 4 to like 10 different pieces that all come together, and each one has to be precisely toleranced, or it'll sit crooked, or it won't fit in the fuselage, or the doors won't be correct, or some other issue will come up where this isn't working right. So that's just one example. Then you have stuff like the canopy that has to be created and tooled up and made. The pitot tube over here has to be tooled up and made. The fuselage has to be tooled up. The intakes have to be tooled. The missiles have to be, you know, molded and tooled up. The landing gear here has to be composed, and the various parts there made up. The vertical stabilizer here and the ventral stabilizer, those parts have to be made. The wings have to be made in a precise order. The connector between the wings has to be done. I can keep going, but basically there's 100 different parts on just this model that have to be individually tooled and created and done perfectly, okay? Because if there's a mistake with any of these little pieces, somebody's going to hear about it, somebody's going to squawk about it, and it's going to, you know, obviously hit the social media waves, right? So each of these pieces has to be individually made and tooled correctly. Then, in addition to this, we have the manufacturing problem of quality control, because just because the factory gets one set correct doesn't mean that the whole production line is going to be correct either. So now, not only does Noel have to make sure that the tooling is correct when making the prototype models, he also has to make sure that somebody checks these over, because what if out of 800 for this guy, 50 of the vertical stabilizers are out of position over here? What if 50 of these guys are broken? Well, 50 out of 800, that's not quite 10%, but it's still a problem for the 50 people who get the wrong one, right? So he's going to have some kind of process to catch these guys in the manufacturing phase, so that there's enough time to fix them before they go to his place, like his factory, to get produced and put together, right? And all that stuff takes time. All that stuff has to be built. All the parts have to be created. All of the individual 100 pieces have to be put together. And then there's the painting. So that has to happen. And he has to probably subcontract that stuff out too, because he's only got 50-something people. So he has to go out to a vendor to give him the parts. He has to go out to a vendor to manufacture the components, a vendor to create the pitot tube and the other pieces. He has to go to a vendor to get the paint stuff done. I mean, each piece of this model has to be, in his case, he has to subcontract virtually all of it because he doesn't have enough people to do everything in-house. And this is where we run into a reason why a lot of the stuff that comes out of Calibre, despite his best efforts, comes out delayed or flawed. Because if any of the subcontractors who are responsible for these parts components or the painting are delayed or have issues, or that he has to rework them behind the scenes, the model has to be delayed as a whole. So with Calibre, because the institution that he has doesn't control in-house these various elements, even a small misalignment with the paint or the parts or something like that, that's going to have implications with the entire model. Because if the whole rest of the model is good, the paint is good, the landing gear is good, but this pylon for some reason is messed up, Noel's going to have to step back to the vendor who makes this guy and say, hey, this pylon is jacked up, you got to fix it. And then he's going to have to wait for that vendor to come back with the fixed versions so that Noel can then put them in the box and then send them out so that people like me and you and other collectors can enjoy them. So until each and every subcomponent of this aircraft, of this particular model, is correct, then you're in a situation of, okay, well, the whole model is 89% done, but if this piece isn't done, then the whole thing has to wait. So any defect in the model, he has to then wait for the vendor to come back and tell him that it's fixed and provide him replacements, which means at this point, because of the subcontracting situation that Noel has, he's really not in control of the deadlines. It's really his subcontractors that are in control of the deadlines. And this is something that needs to be understood by people who like his products, because he may have control over the final result and making sure it's good to go, but he doesn't have control over the rework procedures and individual contributions of each single vendor or factory. Now, some people might say, well, what if he just does everything in-house? Well, the problem is there's two issues with that. The first is cost, right? Because Noel has to now hire hundreds, if not thousands of people who individually specialize in making each individual part to be able to do everything in-house. Then Noel would have complete control of the distribution and the deadlines, because everything would happen within Calibre Wings' sphere of influence. But then he'd have to spend a lot more money, he'd have to hire a lot more people, and more importantly, he'd have to develop expertise, right? Because if Noel hires out, subcontracts, I should say, the paint work, it's going to go to some place that is an expert in applying paint, which means the paint is going to be really good quality, because that's all the subcontractor does. Well, if Noel hires somebody who specializes in paint, he's going to have to bring those people into his company. He's going to have to pay them a salary, and he's going to have to wait, because these people aren't going to be experts in applying models to this kind of thing right away. They're going to have to make some prototypes. They're going to have to create a process. They're going to have to refine that process. And during that time, they're not making any money because they can't make any models until the process is in place. So whenever it comes to manufacturing any large-scale object or item, you have to carefully weigh the balance between bringing everything in-house and subcontracting things out. And oh, by the way, you have to make a profit when you're doing this stuff too. So this is one of those dynamics where, especially with models, which have like a very, it's a weird economic situation with models, because it's not like, say, selling like anything else, like selling milk, where you know people are going to buy it. It's a guess at the time of introduction whether or not all of a certain model are going to be sold, because different collectors have different priorities, and there's no way for a company to know up front that every single model of a certain aircraft is going to sell really well. For example, this particular model is a Splinter F-14. For all Noel knew at the time of making this guy months ago, it may have been a total flop. Maybe only 500 people are really interested in this model. But how does he know that? unless he builds 800 and takes a guess that people would buy it or not, right? So I'm not saying this is a flop. I think actually it's a pretty popular model, but my point is there's no way for Noel to know exactly how many people are going to buy his models until he releases it. And that means he has to take a upfront cost of subcontracting out the construction of these things, bundles them up and sells them in hopes that the distributors at the other end will actually sell enough of them to make a profit so that he can make a profit too, right? So there's some guesswork here. And because of that uncertainty, the lower the cost up front to make these things are, the better, which means he can't just hire all these people to make these models up front and then hope that they sell. There's just no economic, that's just not a smart economic way to run any manufacturing business. So since demand is uncertain, right, we're not selling iPhones that Noel knows is going to get 100% sale rate at the beginning, right? He has to make a batch of these models and guess that they're going to sell. And that also means he has to reduce his upfront cost of production as much as possible. And the best way to do that while also preserving a measure of quality is subcontracting as much of it to outside companies and vendors as possible, which is what he's doing. So it's smart from a business perspective. However, the price, and this is the frustrating bit for both Noel and us collectors, is anytime there's a disruption with one of these vendors, the whole lineup is delayed, right? So instead of it being a situation where Noel produces these models in-house, he looks at them in-house and then he decides to fix it, and then in-house everything happens and it's all smooth. Noel has to subcontract out the construction, which means he has to reach out to that vendor of whatever that piece is that needs to be fixed. The vendor then has to come back to him with whatever proposed solution is. They have to then meet to decide what the solution is. Then the vendor has to turn around and make replacements, and then Noel has to validate the replacements, and then the models can be issued out or corrected as needed, which means even a small change in the production setup of one of Noel's Calibre models is going to take time to address, sometimes years. So consequently, this is why we see such instability with his deadlines, because one small change means a model that was going to come out this month is going to come out in 6 months, because that's how long it takes to reach out to the vendor of the affected piece, to adjust the piece, to review the review piece, to validate it's good to go, and then for the vendor to now produce more of the adjusted pieces, which then need to be assembled. That all takes months. And it's just a nature of manufacturing when you subcontract out your production process, right? So this is just manufacturing as an economic whole, whether you're making alternator parts or washing machines or airplanes. That's pretty much how the whole thing works. And it's kind of an interesting case study, because this is one of the reasons why such real life airplanes like the F-35 and the F-14 when it was in service had issues with serviceability, because take these problems that we're seeing as collectors, right? Malfunctioning pieces with the tail and all that, and just think about the real life airplane and how disruptions with the engines and the avionics and all those real world logistical challenges are faced by fighter airplanes in real life, right? So what we're seeing happen with Noel is kind of a 1/72nd scale version of what we see in real life with F-35s and any other type of fighter airplane that's mass produced. So if you ever wondered why it is the F-35 is delayed all this time, or why it is like the F-14 and the F-16 and the F-15, and why so many of these airplanes have delays and production issues, well, here you go, folks. You're seeing it happen at 1/72nd scale too with Calibre Wings. So I want people to gain some kind of business understanding of how these things go, so that when Noel has a delay or a model is backed up, we kind of put aside some of that frustration and understand that we're all on the same mission of enjoying the hobby and enjoying models and appreciating them when they are released and they are perfect, right? And they're ready to go. So I do want to take a moment here and thank Noel for facing up to the issue of this stabilator over here and taking steps to fix it as best as he can, because he didn't have to do that. He could have just as easily gone into cover-up mode and just pretended there's no issue and then hope that nobody called him out for it and just basically played the Soviet Union style card of just denying a problem never existed. So we do have to give him some props for being upfront and talking about the issue, right away, and confronting it on social media so everyone is clear. So for those people who want to order this guy, as I understand it from Noel's live stream, he has set up an email address. It is Calibre F14, all lowercase, at 123.com. And if you email at that address and you request a TP05 or TP06 in the subject line and you ask for Cali, you can get one of these models. It'll have this issue, but it'll be about 40% off of retail. You will have to pay for shipping, so do bear that in mind when you do the math on the cost. But for those of you who do want to take the plunge and order this guy, the rest of the model looks really good. You just have to be kind of careful about getting this area, putting a couple of pieces of tape there to firm up the fit, and then also to cover up the area where the scratches are. Again, I barely notice it, so it's just a thought that I did to resolve the situation. And if some of you have other ideas on how to fix that, for those who do want to keep their models or order the flawed versions, feel free to share them in the comment section below. So I want to wrap up by saying that I hope to impart some degree of business understanding to people who are understandably frustrated with Calibre Wings' delays, right? They're a young company. They only have not even 60 people on staff. They're a very small operation, and we do need to allow for the fact that unlike established large companies like, say, Hobby Master, who have large offices and in-house production and the ability to control their tooling suppliers and those kind of things, we need to offer some degree of accommodation to Noel for these kind of things. I know he's frustrated when there's a delay. I get frustrated as a collector when I see a model that's supposed to come out in April. It doesn't show up for 6 months later. I get pissed off about it too. I'm frustrated just like anyone else. But we should be clear that Noel is generally not the source of this. He's not just delaying models to torture us. He's doing it because he wants to make sure the outcome is reflective of what collectors and his standards of production are. And for that reason, he does deserve, and his team at Calibre Wings, Cali included and among others, deserves some respect and appreciation from the model community on doing that. And I'll be the first to say that I need to work on this too, because I've been frustrated by delays. I'm a human being. I get wrapped around the axle when I see that a pre-order that I put in last year is still not shipped yet. I get frustrated too. So it's an area that I personally know I need to work on, and that's why I'm making this video, because we all could use some understanding in interacting with both Noel but also other people who are just trying to do the right thing, and sometimes Murphy's Law gets in the way and makes that tough. So thank you for watching this video. Thank you for taking the time to take a look at this, and I look forward to hearing your feedback in the appropriate comments section below. Thanks for tuning into the 172nd Air Wing channel. Have a great day.